Picture a foolish, aging man just, trudging waist-deep through a muggy Florida swamp.
Oh, yeah. Swatting at mosquitoes and everything.
Exactly. Peering under lily pads, desperately searching for some bubbling spring that's going to, erase his wrinkles and restore his youth. I mean, it's the classic story of Juan Ponce de León and the Fountain of Youth. We've all heard it.
Right. It's the version we get in grade school.
Yeah, it's a very comfortable, easy-to-digest myth. But we built this deep dive specifically for you, the listener, because we know you prefer to look past the fairy tales, right? You want to see the actual, often ruthless mechanics of history.
Absolutely. The real story of his life and career is far more complex.
So today, we are stripping away the folklore to examine the real architect of the Spanish Caribbean. We're pulling from a really diverse stack of sources for this one. We've got academic historical analyses, detailed biographies, museum archives,
and even a pretty fascinating discussion thread from the Europa Universalis for gaming community.
Yes, the grand strategy game thread. Synthesizing all of this paints a picture of a very pragmatic, battle-hardened tactician whose real legacy, actually shaped the global economy.
What's fascinating here is the sheer contrast between the pop culture caricature and the historical record. I mean, when we examine the primary documents, the contemporary contracts, the royal decrees, the direct letters between the Spanish crown and Ponce de León, the mythological spring is just, it's entirely absent.
Not a single mention.
Not one. There is zero mention of a fountain of youth. The directives focus exclusively on the mechanics of empire, like land acquisition, pacification of local populations, and obviously the extraction of gold.
Right, the real motivations. And that pragmatic reality, it requires us to look at the military crucible that forged him back in Spain long before he ever set foot on a ship.
Right, his early biography.
Yeah, and our sources point out this significant historical debate regarding his birth date, which fundamentally changes how we view his later adventures. Because for a long time, early historians placed his birth in the year 1460 in a small town called Santervás de Campos.
But modern historical evidence points to a much later date, roughly 1474.
Which is a huge difference.
It is. A 14-year discrepancy completely alters the lens through which we view his famous 1513 expedition to Florida. Because if we accept the 1474 date, he was 39 years old when he landed on the North American mainland.
Oh, wow. So not an old man at all.
Exactly. He wasn't some decrepit senior citizen looking to cure his physical decline. He was a hardened military commander in his physical and tactical prime. And, that aligns much better with the grueling physical demands of organizing and leading a maritime colonial expedition.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to look at the job market in Spain at the time to explain how a guy with his background even ends up across the Atlantic.
Right, the context is everything.
So Ponce de León grew up as a squire. He was immersed in the chivalric code, but more practically, he was trained in heavy military combat. He learned the logistics of siege warfare, the deployment of early firearms, and he fought in the Reconquista, which was the centuries-long war to take back the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors.
A very brutal, sustained conflict.
Yeah. But then, in 1492, Granada falls. The war ends. So Spain essentially experiences this massive corporate downsizing of its military class.
That's a great way to put it.
You suddenly have this entire social stratum of highly trained, ambitious professional soldiers with, no war left to fight and no immediate path to upward mobility.
And then, perfectly timed, Christopher Columbus returns from his first voyage with tales of new lands and unexploited resources.
The ultimate new job market.
Exactly. The New World presented this vast, unregulated frontier for that displaced military caste. So when Ponce de León joins Columbus's second voyage in 1493, his presence on that fleet wasn't out of some romantic desire for exploration. He was a professional soldier stepping into a new theater of operations, basically looking for a lucrative appointment.
He was going where the work was. And the work of establishing a colony required absolute subjugation of the local population.
Yeah, it was not a peaceful endeavor.
Not at all. After arriving in the Caribbean, he settles in Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he first rises to true prominence by crushing a rebellion of the indigenous Taino people in the eastern province of Higüey.
He really leveraged his European military training there.
He did. He deployed armored infantry, cavalry, and firearms to dismantle the local resistance. And the governor at the time, Nicolas de Ovando, recognized that tactical efficiency.
And he rewarded him for it.
Yeah, rewarded him with a provincial governorship and a substantial estate.
Which is key because that reward system is central to understanding the whole colonial engine. The Spanish crown wasn't like paying these soldiers massive salaries. They compensated them with land and labor.
Right, the real currency.
So once he was established in Hispaniola, Ponce de León used his estate to amass personal wealth. He grew crops, raised livestock to supply further Spanish expeditions. But, the ultimate metric of success for a Spanish official back then was mineral wealth, gold.
And he knew it. So he starts hearing these rumors from the local indigenous people about a neighboring island called Borinquen. And supposedly it had these vast, untapped river systems just full of gold.
So he takes action.
Right. In 1506, he basically goes rogue. He finances this secret off-the-books trip just to verify the claims.
An unsanctioned recon mission.
Exactly. And after confirming there is gold, he secures official permission and returns in 1508. He establishes a settlement called Capara, which is near modern-day San Juan, actually making it the oldest known European community in what is now the United States.
That's a huge milestone.
It is. He builds a mining operation, sends the gold back to Spain, and is officially named the first governor of Puerto Rico.
He essentially built a highly efficient economic engine for the Spanish Empire, pulling wealth out of the earth and funneling it across the Atlantic. But the mechanics of that extraction bring us to a really complex contradiction in the historical sources regarding his governance.
Yeah, I noticed a glaring split in how our sources frame his legacy, specifically when it comes to his treatment of the indigenous Taino people.
It's heavily debated.
Very. Because one academic source argues he left a legacy of relatively humane treatment. They point out that he was a skilled negotiator who preferred diplomacy and worked closely with Indian chieftains.
Right.
Yet almost every other source paints a legacy of profound brutality. They highlight the violent suppression of rebellions, the execution of the Taino leader Agüebaná II, and the systemic enslavement of the Taino. So how do academic historians arrive at two completely different interpretations of the same colonial governor?
Well, it comes down to whether historians are prioritizing his initial diplomatic strategies or the long-term structural reality of the system he implemented. To synthesize these accounts impartially, as our sources try to do, we have to look at the encomienda system itself.
The legal framework.
Right. The Spanish crown, legally and theologically, heavily debated the status of indigenous peoples. They couldn't technically be treated as outright chattel slaves under Spanish law if they converted to Christianity. So the crown utilized the encomienda. They granted a Spanish colonist, an encomendero, the right to demand labor and tribute from a specific number of indigenous people. In exchange, the colonist was supposed to, protect them and instruct them in the Catholic faith.
But the operational reality of demanding daily labor in gold mines looks, indistinguishable from slavery.
Precisely. Did Ponce de León negotiate initial alliances? Yes, he did. The sources note he engaged in a Taino diplomatic practice of becoming guatiaos, or blood brothers, with certain local leaders to establish a peaceful foothold.
So that's where the humane narrative comes from.
Exactly. It focuses on those early pragmatic alliances. But his primary overriding directive from the crown was wealth extraction. The quotas for gold required grueling, forced labor.
And people aren't going to just accept that forever.
No, of course not. When the Taino inevitably realized the permanent exploitative nature of this arrangement, they rebelled. And Ponce de León responded as a military commander. He utilized absolute force to suppress the uprisings and maintain the labor supply.
So the differing narratives exist because one focuses on his preference for initial bloodless treaties, while the other focuses on the systemic violence required to execute his royal contracts.
That's exactly it.
He was a company man executing the company's bottom line. And that bottom line demanded the forced labor of the Taino. So by all metrics of the Spanish Empire, he is highly successful. He's extracting gold. He governs Puerto Rico. He holds massive influence.
He's at the top of his game.
Yeah. So I don't understand why a guy who is basically the undisputed CEO of Puerto Rico would risk all of that wealth to sail off into unknown, potentially hostile waters. I mean, was it just pure, unfiltered greed for more territory?
It actually wasn't greed. It was political survival. He was forced out of his position.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The historical catalyst for the famous Florida expedition was the Pleitos Colombinos, the Colombian lawsuits.
Oh, this is the drama with Christopher Columbus's family holding the Spanish crown legally accountable, right?
Exactly. Diego Colón, Columbus's son, initiates this prolonged legal battle. He argues that the original hereditary privileges granted to his father meant that he, Diego, Diego should be the absolute ruler of all the newly discovered islands in the Caribbean.
And that included Puerto Rico.
It did.
So it's basically the 16th century equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover. You have this self-made executive, Ponce de León, who built the Puerto Rico infrastructure from the ground up. Then the founder's son leverages a legal loophole in a decades-old contract and completely ousts him.
And King Ferdinand of Spain found himself in a really precarious position here. He valued Ponce de León. He was a loyal, competent governor who consistently enriched the royal treasury.
Right, a good earner.
Exactly. Conversely, the king was deeply suspicious of the Columbus family accumulating a hereditary monopoly over the New World. But the Spanish legal courts in Seville reviewed the original contracts signed with Christopher Columbus and ultimately ruled in favor of his son Diego.
Wow. So by late 1511, Ponce de León is stripped of his governorship. He is out of a job again.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely reframes the 1513 expedition. It wasn't a midlife crisis-seeking youth, it was a career pivot.
He got a new gig.
Right. King Ferdinand felt an obligation to his loyal servant. So to bypass the Columbus monopoly, the king gave Ponce de León a new contract, authorizing him to discover and settle the rumored islands of Bimini to the north.
So if he found new, unclaimed land, he'd be granted the governorship for life, entirely independent of Diego Colón's jurisdiction. He needed a new territory to rule because his old one had been legally confiscated.
Exactly.
So in March of 1513, he funds his own expedition, outfits 3 ships, and sails north. And by April, he hits the North American mainland.
Right, Florida.
Yeah, assuming it's a massive undiscovered island. And arriving during the Easter season, which is known in Spanish as Pascua Florida, the Festival of Flowers, he names the land La Florida and claims it for Spain.
But the real prize wasn't the land.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources reveal his greatest discovery on that voyage wasn't land at all. The true geopolitical prize was the water.
The accidental masterpiece of his career was mapping the Gulf Stream.
Yes.
During the coastal exploration of Florida, his chief pilot, Anton de Alaminos, observed a severe anomaly in the water's behavior. The records describe how, even with the wind filling their sails, the ships were physically pushed backward.
They had inadvertently navigated into one of the strongest ocean currents on the planet.
Yeah, the Gulf Stream.
But recognizing an invisible underwater river while you're just sailing a wooden caravel, that requires incredible navigational awareness. How did Alaminos actually identify it?
Well, 16th century navigation relied heavily on dead reckoning.
Which is what, exactly?
It's calculating your current position based on your previously determined position, your speed, and your course. Alaminos noticed that their calculated speed through the water did not match their actual speed over the seabed.
Ah, I see.
The current was flowing north and east with such immense hydraulic force that it was literally overpowering the wind. And Alaminos grasped the strategic implications immediately.
Because prior to this, getting back to Europe was a nightmare.
It was. Returning to Europe from the Caribbean involved slow, unpredictable sailing through variable winds. By mapping the Gulf Stream's path out of the Florida Straits and up the coast, Alaminos and Ponce de León discovered a high-speed oceanic highway.
That's incredible. And for the next 3 centuries, the Spanish treasure fleets used that exact current to propel heavily laden ships full of gold and silver back across the Atlantic.
It was vital infrastructure.
So he went looking for a consolation prize to govern, and he mapped the maritime infrastructure that would fuel the global economy for hundreds of years. He returns to Spain, receives the official title of military governor of Florida, and secures the royal blessing to colonize it.
But, a title meant very little without physical control of the territory.
Very true.
He actually delayed his return to Florida to establish that permanent colony until 1521. And the landscape of resistance he faced upon his return was fundamentally different from anything he had encountered in the Caribbean.
Right. He probably expected another scenario where he could utilize initial diplomacy followed by, overwhelming European military tactics. But the people waiting for him, the Calusa tribe, they were an entirely different kind of empire.
They really were.
There's this fascinating discussion in that Europa Universalis gaming source we mentioned earlier. The players talk about how historical strategy models often struggle to categorize the Calusa because they completely break the traditional tech tree of civilization building.
Because they didn't rely on agriculture.
Exactly. They built a complex, highly stratified society entirely on the biological productivity of the Everglades estuaries.
The Calusa are a remarkable case study in political hegemony. Without farming a single crop of maize, they supported a massive population through sophisticated fishing, hunting, and gathering.
They engineered massive shell mound cities.
Yeah, shell mounds, intricate canals, fish weirs. And they maintained a fierce tribute network that controlled the entire southern half of the Florida peninsula. They were a formidable military force, adapted perfectly to their estuarine environment.
Furthermore, they weren't caught off guard. Unlike the Taíno decades earlier, the Calusa likely had forewarning of the Spanish presence.
Oh, almost certainly.
Because there were extensive maritime trade networks between Florida and the Caribbean. It's highly probable that indigenous refugees fleeing that brutal encomienda system in Cuba and Hispaniola had already crossed the straits and warned the Calusa about these armored men who demanded gold and enslaved populations.
They possessed the crucial advantage of intelligence. So when Ponce de León arrives in 1521 with 200 settlers, 50 horses, priests, livestock.
Making his intent to stay pretty obvious.
Exactly. The Calusa deploy immediate, aggressive military resistance. They actively drove the Spanish colonizing force back to the beaches during a series of really intense skirmishes.
They successfully repelled a heavily armed European force using superior numbers, terrain advantage, and a terrifying biological weapon. The Calusa utilized the manchineel tree.
The manchineel is native to the region and remains one of the most toxic trees on Earth. The sap contains potent fourballs and other severe skin irritants.
Just standing under it is dangerous, right?
Yeah. Historical and modern accounts warn that even standing under a manchineel tree during a rainstorm can cause severe blistering because the water literally washes the toxins from the leaves onto your skin.
Wow.
And the Calusa weaponized this environment, coating their arrowheads in that caustic sap.
And during the chaotic beach skirmishes, Ponce de León is struck in the thigh by one of these poisoned arrows. The toxins cause massive inflammation, necrosis, and systemic poisoning. The wound is incapacitating.
It was a lethal strike.
Combined with the overwhelming tactical superiority of the Calusa forces, the Spanish expedition just shatters. They abandon the colonization effort, load their wounded onto the ships, and retreat across the straits to Havana, Cuba. And in July of 1521, just a few days after arriving in Havana, Juan Ponce de León dies from the poisoned wound. He was 47.
It was an abrupt, violent conclusion to a life defined by relentless ambition, political maneuvering, and military conquest. He was ultimately defeated by a society that outmaneuvered him on their own terms.
So what does this all mean? Looking at the totality of his timeline, from a displaced soldier in a post-war Spain to the ruthless administrator of Hispaniola, the architect of Puerto Rico, the mapper of the Gulf Stream, and finally meeting his match in the estuaries of Florida, how should we contextualize his historical footprint?
Juan Ponce de León was the operational tip of the spear for the Spanish Empire in the Americas. He was not a whimsical explorer chasing folklore. He was a foundational architect of the Caribbean colonial system.
Right.
He codified the methodologies of extraction, settlement, and systemic forced labor that Spain would utilize for centuries. But simultaneously, mapping the Gulf Stream fundamentally changed global trade and maritime navigation. His life drove the vast machinery of a rising global empire, for better and for worse.
The actual human motivations, the corporate-style ousters, the pursuit of labor monopolies, the biological warfare in the swamps, they just reveal a history infinitely more complex than the sanitized myths we were taught as kids.
And, considering that stark contrast between the complex administrator and the myth of the foolish old man, this raises an important question. There's a final provocative detail in our academic sources worth considering.
Look at it.
The earliest written association between Ponce de León and the Fountain of Youth doesn't appear until years after his death.
Really?
Years later.
Yeah. It was published by Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo. And Oviedo was a Spanish historian who was aligned politically with the Columbus family, specifically Diego Colón.
Wait, the same man who legally ousted him from Puerto Rico?
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
It raises a fascinating possibility. What if the very thing that made Juan Ponce de León immortal in our pop culture wasn't an organic romantic legend? What if it was actually a highly successful 500-year-old political smear campaign?
A smear campaign.
A calculated public relations move designed by his rivals to posthumously assassinate his character. Think about it turning a highly capable, dangerous, and ruthless military rival into a vain, delusional old man chasing magic water in the woods. That is brilliant. Makes you wonder how much of the history we accept as fact is simply the lingering result of ancient PR wars.
Exactly.
A 500-year-old smear campaign that works so flawlessly, society is still repeating the joke today. Well, next time you picture that aging man wandering the swamp, remember the displaced conquistador, the toxic arrow, and the invisible river powering an empire. Thanks for exploring the sources with us today. Keep questioning the myths.